A lively conversation begins inside a cafe called Apricity, where someone excitedly asks how much time has passed. Four girls are sitting at a table with Kang Doha, as it was their first time meeting since elementary school, and they missed Doha due to her absence. They mention with interest that Doha was suddenly transferred, and she had mentioned at the time that it was in the third year, though she didn't say where. Doha scratches her neck, a bit nervous, and starts to say the name of the place called Gukji Island School. But she is interrupted by a voice from another table shouting that the video of Lee Ro-woon has been released, stealing the women's attention. They get excited at the mention of Lee Ro-woon, quickly grabbing their phones to search on YouTube, insinuating that Doha should search for him too as he is very famous. One of the girls shows a guy with short, light-colored hair on her phone, saying that this video was published on the official account of Gukji Island School, and indeed he was a handsome man. On the screen, the host greets the viewers and introduces himself as Naboom, revealing that the videos from this school were famous on social media. Students with such high levels of talent in areas like playing musical instruments were only 1% of the talented people in Korea. Today, they would meet some of the protagonists of the video as the host Naboom and his team were invited to Gukji Island School. With a bright smile, Lee introduces himself as one of the students from that school. Next to him, a girl with light-colored hair introduces herself as Han Leeji, another student, and Lee mentions that there are others who have introduced themselves, asking for them to be added in the subtitles. This makes the host Naboom laugh, as Lee knew the broadcasts very well. In the audience, several girls hold signs smiling happily to see Lee smitten with him. The host says that his popularity was indeed impressive and that he even looked like an idol. Lee laughs and denies it, saying he was sure everyone was busy now due to exams and thanks the freshmen for being there, making the audience go wild. Naboom focuses on Lee first and asks if he received any support from the school to be so active in various aspects. To which he agrees, as the school has a remarkable curriculum and a support system that fosters talents with great teachers and facilities. The host then turns to Leeji, who is having trouble opening a water bottle but puts it aside when receiving attention. The man says the students are actively working and promoting with famous multinational companies due to their remarkable curriculum and support system. While Lee opens a water bottle, the host mentions that this was a renowned school in the world, hearing that a large part of the students are Korean, even though the school is not in Korea, while Lee offers the opened water bottle to Leeji. The girl blushes a bit as she accepts the bottle, agreeing with the question, as the school is located on Gukji Island, southeast of Asia, with students living in dormitories. Doha's friends excitedly comment on how Lee opened the bottle for Leeji and decide to save that clip because they loved the scene. They mention that Lee was the son of the president of the Hosung Group, being handsome and a gentleman, practically the perfect man, and a celebrity even abroad. Lee says that the dormitories are known to be the pride of Gukji Island School. During the weekdays, all students must stay in the dormitories, and Naboom asks if the rooms are changed since he heard that each dormitory has changes every semester. When the women at the table turn their attention back to Doha, they nervously ask what school she transferred to, pretending interest. And she nervously starts to answer, despite having said it at least once before. Gukji School with its students is always a hot topic for people thanks to this system that has healthy competition. In the end, on her plane trip, Doha cries because she couldn't even tell her friends that she was at Gukji School, and even though she was happy, she now wanted to cry for real. Outside, through the window, she could see the island they were approaching to land. After getting off, dragging her suitcase through the streets, she thinks that, as expected, going to school by plane. It was still something she couldn't get used to, but Doha still needed to make her way through the car-filled streets to the school. Stopping walking, the protagonist wipes the sweat from her forehead and raises her eyes to what lay ahead. The large building of the school she was attending, Gukji Island School, where only the best could enter. Crossing the streets, Doha passes through the parking lot to enter through the school doors. She looks around to see where she should go and then enters the elevator to go up the floors, heading to the 13th floor of that building. When she steps out of the elevator, the protagonist is met with a luxurious room where a shirtless Lee asks if she had already arrived. This catches Doha off guard and completely by surprise. Still, she sighs and asks him to put on some clothes, to which he responds that it was his room anyway. Doha complains because she also lived there with him and he should consider her situation, to which Lee just ends up agreeing. As she walks away, Lee puts on a t-shirt and asks if she saw the video that was posted on YouTube that day, to which she agrees. This makes him ask if it was cool and what she thought of the whole performance. Do-ha looks up and agrees that it wasn't bad at all. The way he grabbed and opened the bottle passively was good, not showing anything obvious to the audience. Then he suddenly lifts a book called Guide to Actions That Make Every Woman Swoon, full of page markers. He says that this was the result of his bloodthirsty practice, which makes Do-ha just agree without caring much, wondering when he turned that into notebook annotations. She turns to lift the suitcases, but Lee quickly grabs the suitcase from her hands, saying he is in the middle of one of the best trainings she taught him, since she also taught him to carry things for girls, making the two get very close to each other. Even though she agrees, not seeming interested, Do-ha's ears were burning red. Lee asks if she was okay, and she gets distracted without understanding what she just heard, her whole face blushing this time. He approaches to touch her forehead, commenting that she must have a fever to have such hot skin, catching Do-ha by surprise again. The boy mentions that he will get a wet towel for her, still with his hand on her forehead, exchanging glances with the protagonist. Then he steps away to wet a cloth under the sink to help his friend, while Do-ha herself wonders what all that was about, as she hadn't even taught that, but he was already applying it anyway. Time passes and soon it gets dark in the school dormitories. Do-ha is lying in her room, sighing with that wet towel covering her eyes. Meanwhile, Lee is calmly sitting, reading his notebook full of notes and markings. The protagonist removes the cloth from her forehead, unable to believe she was using a VIP room with that famous Lee Ro-woon, and she wonders how things ended up in such a problematic way. A few months earlier, our protagonist had arrived to finally enter the school alongside several other students. It was her first day at the Gucci Islands College, and Do-ha was radiant with excitement about the new school life. Unable to believe she was really studying in that incredible place, she could only stare at the building with a radiant expression. Upon entering the corridors, she got lost while looking for room 301. Nervously looking around, two guys walk by chatting animatedly. One of them bumps into Do-ha as they pass without realizing they were taking up too much space in the corridors. In the process, her black cat keychain fell off her bag. The protagonist looked back in the direction of the boys who bumped into her, and they didn't seem to care. Even after touching the shoulder, they'd been bumped to the point of feeling a little pain. Suddenly, someone bends down to pick up her cat keychain. The protagonist realizes a little later that she had dropped it, stopping when this person approached. This someone was Lee, who extended the keychain for Do-ha to take back, catching her off guard with his bright eyes and kindness. Nervously, Do-ha takes her keychain back and thanks him while stuttering, still amazed because he was gorgeous with a stunning face. Lee turns to the two boys who bumped into her and calls their attention, alerting them to watch where they're going because they just bumped into someone, which makes the two apologize, leaving Do-ha a little amazed. Finally, she finds the room 301 she was looking for. But even Lee and those two boys enter that room that Do-ha intended to enter too. It seemed they were classmates as well on top of everything. Watching Lee's face talking to the other students, she approaches slowly and takes her backpack off her back, until someone shouts asking if she was crazy. Holding Do-ha's backpack strap, she stops walking until looking back to find another girl with light hair whom the protagonist recognizes as Yura. Yura says that's where the summer kids sit and they couldn't stay in those seats. Yura was Do-ha's friend who lived in the room next to hers. The protagonist follows Yura, looking from her friend to the seat where Lee was, asking what summer was. The friend turns back, asking if she didn't remember what was explained yesterday, as the school was characterized by having dormitories divided into ranks. In the red table was the summer dormitory, in the yellow the magna dormitory, in the green the cum dormitory, and in the fourth the satis dormitory, lastly the apathetic dormitory. Do-ha questions if it wasn't just for dormitories because she thought they had classes equally, confused by what she was hearing now. And Yura sits down, saying that everyone was taking care of themselves without following the rules, making the protagonist follow her. Finally, a voice asks all the students to sit down at once, and they realize that the teacher had finally arrived in the classroom, making the students sit in their places. The teacher asks why it was so dark and uses a remote control to open some of the curtains on the side. Thus, the automatic curtains open to reveal the glorious ocean outside the school buildings. Yura says that this was just a school where the children of the highest class could attend, the school on Gucci Island. It was a prestigious private boarding school that was established through the purchase of an entire island in Southeast Asia. The students who attended there were among the second or third best generations of Korea's chaebols. Even if they belong to a lower status, these are children of politicians, doctors, judges, and renowned lawyers. As a result, all the facilities are of the highest quality and the meals are served in Michelin-starred restaurants. Time passes and the students leave after classes now that it was finally the weekend and the trip to and from Seoul was made by plane. All the students were equipped with the best accessories and the best items to live in that school. The school was full of students who wore luxury brands from all over the world, always with the best products to use in their daily lives. Yura goes down the stairs, saying that the most popular among all the students couldn't be anyone else but Lee Ro-woon, who walked among several girls who were in love with him just by seeing him pass by. He was the son of the Haesung Group, #1 in the domestic business world, and was included in one of the largest groups in the world by Forbes, being known as the island celebrity, practically the richest student in that school, always receiving attention from everyone who saw him. During just 3 years at the school, he never left the summer VIP room of the first dormitory, and even now he drove high-quality cars and was accompanied by beautiful girls. Walking on the sidewalk, the protagonist continues listening to her friend Yura's explanations about the difference in the construction of all the buildings of the first, second, third, and fourth dormitories that decreased in size and quality. Lastly, there is the fifth dormitory where Yura and Doha were living now. As the two go to a vending machine to get water, the protagonist complains that it is unfair. Even though she understands that they paid different amounts for the dormitories, the school facilities are shared to the point that Doha is frustrated because not even the machine works. After pressing the button several times and being notified that she couldn't use this machine, Yura just rested her face on her hand and watched her friend's irritation until she reached out to press one of the buttons for her, finally allowing a bottle of water to fall for Doha. Catching the protagonist by surprise, Yura explains that the school's amenities were included in the dormitory fee. Therefore, each cafeteria has different things they could use, and even the buttons on the machines were different. Moreover, if you break the rules, you would receive a penalty, and after accumulating them, you could be expelled from the school, a warning Yura gave to Doha. Some people may criticize the school for its discrimination, but what else could they do? It was a world-class, first-class school, and they still acted like that. Yura asks if she wasn't going to pack her bags because everyone returned to Korea on weekends, and the protagonist opens her bottle, replying that her parents told her to stay there because they went abroad, giving a fake smile because only the rich could go back to Korea every weekend. The day passes and soon it gets dark on the island where the protagonist's dormitory was located. Precisely because she didn't have as much money as the others, she was the only one left at the school for the weekend. All the summer went on their private jets, the others flew first class or business, but Doha couldn't do that. She stayed in her room, not even qualified for the basement room in Apotheke. If by chance they knew she went there, after complications, she wouldn't even be treated as a human being. So until graduation, she would try to become a wallflower, someone who doesn't socialize because she is completely excluded, and she thinks this while holding her blue stone necklace. For Doha, it was better to remain carefree, and she recalls that the dormitory assignments change every 3 months. So as long as she attends school, there was still a chance to move to a better dormitory than the current one. Or rather, it was possible only if her parents won the lottery because it was necessary to have enough resources to cover the dormitory fees for each room. Even grades and the results of the organized council popularity votes are reflected in this. This was the only time Doha could live at the same level as them, she said to her necklace while communicating with a girl with long black hair on the other side. The girl happily says that at least she got in and that her sister was proud because later she could enter the Ivy League employed with a free pass. Moreover, being near where Lee is, she could breathe the same air as him, something super lucky that made Doha's sister very happy to imagine. But the protagonist wasn't excited and says she saw the Lee she adored so much that day in class, which excites her sister to know how it was. Remembering Lee, Doha admits that he was handsome, like the compilation of all the features women like, which makes her sister sigh, dying of envy at being able to see him in person. Until her sister is called for a video call by some people, caught off guard when called writer Kang. And she apologizes to Doha because she entered a meeting with other writers and decides to end the conversation for now. ending the conversation to discuss with a smile on the video call about the reorganization of the program they were talking about together. Some suggest that they could handle Lee Rowan that week because he recently became very popular, and she agrees with the proposal, agreeing that it was a great idea, pretending to be a normal person despite her room being full of Lee's things, sitting in her wheelchair during the video call. Meanwhile, the protagonist sighs at the end of the call with her sister, and something catches her attention. Looking at the desk mirror, she stares at her blue stone necklace shining on her chest. In Dova's family, the fraternal twins had a very special secret. She shifts her eyes to the family photo beside the mirror, where the two sisters and their parents were. When they were born, they had the same special ability, unique to the Kang family. If they had the Parain stone, they could communicate telepathically with each other, and both Doha's sister, who had an earring, and Doha herself, who had a necklace of the same stone. Time passes to the following Saturday, where she rides a scooter, wondering what the point of having such an ability was if her family was so poor. She sighs while riding around the campus. At least it was great that everything was quiet without all the other students to cause chaos around. Suddenly, a black cat runs in front of her, catching Doha by surprise, making her stop her scooter and follow the cat with her eyes as she sees it enter the nearby bushes. The cat looks in her direction, confused, as she wonders if it was lost since it was still a cute little animal. The protagonist approaches it and crouches to admire the cat with a smile, thinking the animal was super cute. But when she does so, the cat runs away, making her sad for scaring the little animal. Dova sneaks into the bushes, looking for where the cat was and asking where it was going, wanting to follow it. Despite chasing the cat, she crawls through the bushes with some difficulty and realizes that the animal was entering a hole in a white wall, which confuses her because it was a dog hole for passing through. She asks the cat to wait, but it goes into the hole anyway and ignores her, making her run to peek inside the hole, wondering where it would lead, until she sees a large, luxurious space with a pool and several arranged chairs. Doha enters the place and is impressed with how beautiful the construction was, walking near the pool and admiring it. Finally, she realizes that this must be the exclusive pool for the summer dormitory. Meanwhile, a voice shouts asking Lee to wait. It was a blonde-haired girl running after him, asking if he really intended to swim, following him down a hallway. She says that actually she had something to tell him, and hearing the conversation after hiding behind a tree was Doha, wondering why they appeared suddenly there when they should return from Seoul only the next day. The protagonist found herself in trouble because if people from other dormitories use this, they could be penalized, and she quickly looks for a place to hide. Lee looks at the blonde and asks what she wanted to say, which makes the girl hesitate on how to speak what she wanted. And Doha realizes she is in a bad situation as they could see her at any moment. Looking back at a pool with a leaf floating on the water, she thinks it doesn't matter now. The blonde gets nervous, saying it was strange to say this here, suggesting they return to the dormitory lounge, but Lee looks to the other side when something catches his attention, and slowly asks the blonde girl why she wanted to go back just for that. She says she is feeling a bit cold, fidgeting in a way that says she just wants to be alone with him somewhere else. Meanwhile, Doha had entered the pool and put the leaf on her head to disguise herself and prevent being seen. The protagonist could understand that embarrassing situation even without looking at Lee. It was clearly an attempt at a confession from the blonde girl. Lee says that if she is cold, she doesn't need to accompany him, and decides to increase the air conditioner temperature with the remote, leaving the girl frustrated with how slow he was. Doha is impressed with the way he avoided it, and it seemed that the atmosphere between them was not good at all, contrary to what she thought at first. Then the girl insists that she is also hungry and suggests they go in to eat ramen, leaning close to him, which leaves Doha surprised because that phrase was almost a confession, and it was impressive because just dating Lee by itself should be amazing enough. But the idiot Lee smiles and says it's a relief because there is ramen here too, pressing a button on the remote, and a drawer with several instant noodles appears, which obviously leaves both the blonde girl and Doha disappointed with how stupid and slow he could be with the advances. Lee gets excited because he didn't know she liked ramen and shows her the various flavor options for her to try, which didn't make the girl very happy. Doha wonders if he was pretending to be stupid and drawing a line of distance because the woman's intentions were as clear as day. until she simply decides to hug Lee's arm, trying to be even more direct than before, suggesting they go back to the room and watch Netflix, blushing a little with the even clearer flirtatious proposal with ulterior motives. But from the boy's facial expression, even Doha was impressed by his cluelessness. Then he pushes the girl away, holding her by the shoulders, asking if she was hurt somewhere because her face was all red, and touches her forehead to check if she had a fever, practically catching the blonde off guard again with how clueless she was. The protagonist even feels bad for the woman because so far he hadn't realized he was being seduced for the third time. Lee steps away from her, saying he had a first aid kit somewhere in that modern pool, worrying the protagonist when she realizes she could be seen. Doha hides underwater and pinches her nose, wondering why he decided to go in that direction. The blonde girl quickly grabs his wrist and suggests they could look together, which makes him question why. After all, he wanted to swim in the pool now and nothing else, stopping at the edge of the pool. The protagonist mentally begs for them to take Lee away from there once and for all, that idiot who was just ruining everything. Still, he continues asking if he couldn't swim after all. The sun was setting, and he wanted to enjoy that little available time. Meanwhile, Doha was taking the opportunity to catch her breath, coming up to the surface. The frustrated blonde girl responds that it wasn't that at all. But despite her irritation, just looking at Lee's face made her heart beat faster. And she cheers up again, saying it's okay, and that he could swim, saying goodbye, and that she would go to the kids first. Even though she was mentally crying, if it wasn't for that beautiful face, she would have forgotten Lee for sure. The boy just watches her go without understanding anything. After all, she always acted that strange way, and he wonders if she was really okay. The protagonist just watches the scene, feeling bad for the woman and surprised by the scene. Wondering what happened, because it seemed she was being deceived after all. Lee should be a dating master like a celebrity, but he was just a big idiot. When he decides to swim, the protagonist freezes in place and realizes she was in serious trouble. He starts to undress, lowering the zipper of his shirt, and stretches, ready to dive into the pool to refresh himself. The sight of Lee was beautiful enough to make Doha nervous and hesitate to move, until she remembers that she couldn't get caught and sinks into the pool, which catches his attention. She pinches her nose, thinking that if she got caught, she would be penalized in her first week after being transferred. And worst of all, she would be known as a weird, perverse stalker, and her plans to have a reserved life would be ruined. Lee kneels at the edge of the pool, finding it strange to have heard something nearby. After some time, Doha feels she can no longer hold her breath underwater, and the bubbles from her breath catch Lee's attention, making him realize something was wrong. The protagonist couldn't hold her breath any longer and finally releases it, emerging desperately from the water right in front of the boy who was watching, not understanding anything. But Doha rose too quickly and hit her head hard against the boy, pushing him back. And she herself returns to the water, not understanding what happened or what she had just hit. Lee was dizzy from the hit to the head and leaned against the pool, before finally looking back into the water. While Doha was touching her injured forehead, confused, the boy jumped into the pool and hovered near where she was swimming. The two stared at each other closely, and Lee held her in his arms, Doha still holding her breath. Lee stared, wondering what was wrong with this girl, and the protagonist takes a while to understand what was happening, even feeling embarrassed by the proximity. Then she uses his shoulders as support to rise in the water, passing by him. Meanwhile, Lee notices that she was wearing a necklace that caught his attention. Again, she uses him as a springboard, jumping on his shoulders to swim to the surface, leaving him behind. Lee is shocked that he was just stepped on in such a strange way, simply as support, until Doha finally rises from the pool, almost fainting from lack of air, and surprised to make eye contact with Lee suddenly. But before she can escape, his hand grabs her ankle. Furious, he asks where she thought she was going. Doha screams and pulls her foot, reflexively kicking Lee in the face. Immediately realizing what she just did, she nervously apologizes, but the boy is really angry now. Then she runs away while Lee shouts, asking who she was, telling her to stop. Since Doha didn't stop, he jumped into the pool and chased her, still shouting through the beach house. The protagonist almost cries, realizing that the great Lee Rowoon was chasing her, feeling like a dream. She runs down a hallway and quickly turns to evade him. until she notices something. It was the black cat lying calmly near the rest house, yawning. Later, Lee appears and looks around for Doha and where she had gone. Meanwhile, she had managed to crawl under the hole in the wall and escape, sighing in relief. It was great that Lee wasn't just an idiot, but also didn't have sharp eyes to notice her hiding place. The boy runs his hand through his hair, certain that Doha wasn't one of the Summers, still wondering where she went. Actually, her face seemed familiar, but the necklace she was wearing was what truly caught his attention. He removes his earring, thinking it must be the same type of stone he was wearing. A little later, Lee returns inside the house where the students were, and they ask what happened and if he didn't go swimming. He says that someone entered the pool area, and one of the girls is surprised because it was the weekend and everyone had left. Lee says he didn't think she was one of them, possibly from a different dormitory, which was very bold of her to invade like that at the cost of the penalty. The girl hugs the pillow and says she fears it was some kind of pervert. When asked what happened at the pool, Lee falls silent, recalling all the humiliation he went through, and just decides to pretend nothing happened as she just disappeared somewhere else, leaving them confused by his pause. Just thinking about it made him angry, and now Lee was determined to find and catch Doha to get revenge. One of the students says there's nothing to do and changes the subject, saying that an emergency meeting was about to start, telling him to sit down. The blonde girl says that in the next room change, apparently, one of them would be downgraded to Magna. The boy sadly agrees that due to the recent drop in oil prices, his father's company was in difficult situations and on the brink of collapse. Of all the industries, he is upset that his family is in the oil refinery industry and everything was going wrong. The green-haired girl asks what they would do if Il is demoted, because it would be hard for him to hang out with them in summers and his pride would diminish being in Magna. Lee says there is nothing to be done, so they had to win the competition, and the blonde-haired girl asks how they would do that. One of them suggests that they could earn extra points with grades and popularity votes, and the green-haired girl agrees because had high grades. The blonde says it's just a small difference, and there was still a chance to increase the popularity ranking, which makes another girl suggest throwing a party. Meanwhile, the protagonist went back to where her scooter was, giving a heavy sigh because it had been an unnecessarily long day. She picks up a scooter and looks around, hoping at least that black cat found its owner. Doha holds a necklace and lets it go, more worried about almost being penalized in her first week, and starts talking to her sister who met Lee again. She says he was completely different from the images of him that the media showed. But as she says nothing more, the protagonist is confused and keeps asking if her sister was listening. This confuses her because maybe her sister was asleep despite not being able to hear her responses. Doha continues, shouting for her sister Kang Do-hee, who should be hearing her words. But Do-hee's earring was now being worn by Lee, who was completely unaware of what was happening. Still, he heard voices shouting and looked around, wondering what happened, leaving his friends worried. He says he heard someone shouting, but his friends confirm they heard nothing. Doha says maybe she is asleep, but mentions seeing Lee in the pool area and thought he was really slow, which makes Lee hear everything in his mind without understanding anything. She says she thought he would be a master of dating, so when she wakes up later, she asks Do-hee to call her to tell the details. This leaves Lee confused, wondering where he was hearing that voice from and how she could have called him slow like that. The boy crosses his arms, reflecting that the person in the voice said she saw him in the pool, trying to connect the dots of what is happening. And he realizes it must have been the girl from before, but wonders what is happening for him to hear her voice. Time passes to Monday morning back at school. One of Lee's friends was making a call to confirm O's party. The conversation catches the protagonist's attention, who looks in his direction with interest regarding the party. The boy suggests to his friends the Big Charm barbecue restaurant near the gate behind the school, because it was a place famous for their grilled steak. As expected, the school's food was really delicious. The protagonist looks at the boy with a bored expression, wondering what exactly he was talking about. The girls look at O with disdain when he says it was a bad place because it had a Michelin rating of 2 stars. The truth was that the girls had little desire to deal with the grill and were clearly frustrated with the situation. The blonde thinks she would never grill the meat alone by the owner's rules, while the other shudders at the thought that the ventilation was bad and they would be covered in smoke. Finally, Lee intervenes, asking why they would have a barbecue at the party, which makes the 2 girls very happy. As expected, Lee always gave the best ideas. Doha thinks it was impressive. He was saying the right thing for the first time in his life, and in the end, he shouldn't be that dumb. Then he suggests they all go to chili crabs because the food had a divine taste that would make them want to lick the sauce. The vision seemed even more ridiculous than the previous one. The atmosphere was far from pleasant. Even though the girls were contemplating the scene with pure disappointment, the boys were all happy with the idea. In the end, Doha sighs because the disappointment of something obvious didn't hit her as much. Anyway, Lee looks at the blonde girl Mina and asks what she is thinking, because that restaurant was the most expensive there, and he was clearly proud of his suggestion. The girl, despite hating it, clasps her hands together, and just because she likes him, agrees that she loved his idea, leaving Doha impressed. The other girl just agrees to go along with Lee's idea about the chili crabs restaurant. Thus, the friends finally come to a conclusion about the decision of where they would have the party. The protagonist, just listening to the conversation, wonders if they were really serious about this. Looking back, she realizes they really had a problem, especially Lee Ro-woon. Despite him being super cool and catching the attention of the girls who fall for him, even during fencing classes at school, the truth was that he was a big fool. Lee approaches Oh, who says they can invite other people besides the Summers, as it's best to invite as many people as possible to increase his popularity. He approaches Mina and says it's her turn for the practical class. So the two go to the front to face each other in fencing. She asks him not to go easy on her just because she's weak, and Lee asks if he could really do that. Without hesitating to use force against her, who asked not to use force just out of consideration, thinking he would be gentle at least in this, leaving her nervous, wondering if he really intended to do that to her. Lee was a complete fool who didn't understand simple things like that and says it should be bearable, attacking the poor girl without mercy until Mina was face down on the ground, and he just smiled, all proud of having knocked her down like that. Doha thinks that at the height of his insensitivity, Lee was far from having any delicacy to understand women's feelings. Later, the friends gather to discuss whether they should stop inviting the Kums while eating together. Mina says their standards would be low if they invited them. And one of the boys says that if O confesses well, the Summers and Magnus will take care of it and spread the word to the rest of the dormitories. During the meal, Lee noticed that Jessica was holding her shoulder with a tense face and asks why she wasn't eating, which catches the protagonist's attention as she was observing them. Jessica says she is tired because it had been a long time since she did fencing, clearly tense. And Lee insists that she still needs to eat to gain energy, smiling. Something that the girl agrees to, looking at him while cutting some pieces of her meat, clearly hungry. Mina gets frustrated because Lee was indifferent to her, but seemed to be taking care of Jessica, cutting pieces of meat like that. He extends it for Jessica to eat, surprising Mina with his quickness. But instead of meat, what he offered was the eating tool itself, disappointing both girls, although Mina expected this from the beginning. Doha drinks water, watching the scene, thinking he was going too far with his lack of consideration and tastes. Later, discussing what was most important at the party, Mina says they should discuss the main event, super excited. One of the boys asks what they should do as the main scenario. And of course, Jessica and Mina think of romantic things like couple dances or kissing time, which again catches Doha's attention as she eats while listening to them. Oh asks Lee what he would like to do at the party they were preparing. Although the two girls were excited about the idea of romance, he replies that he doesn't know and starts to think, suggesting they could play PVG simply out of nowhere after thinking a lot, destroying all the girls' dreams and expectations of romance as they just look disappointed in his direction. But the other boys are super happy with the suggestion and already imagine they would need a big screen. In the end, Doha knew that Lee was above all eccentric with his thoughts and actions. Still, she could understand how and why Lee ended up being such an idiot. She watches as Lee and his friends chat super excitedly about that decision on the games, and thinks he could be insensitive, reckless, and egocentric, but not just because he was an idiot, but totally ignorant of his actions. Because even if he says something wrong or strange, people just agree with him and never tell the truth. So his friends all agree with Lee's decisions, and the girls say he was really cool and nice. That's why he is never aware of anything, accepting the flattery and honestly believing it. But without wealth or honor, possibly all this life of comfort and acceptance would collapse. What worried Doha was the image of one day Lee being abandoned, and she wonders if he would be okay. She shakes her head, wondering why she was worried about something like that when she herself was in the lowest class and would never get involved with him anyway. and didn't even wish to get involved with a person like that. There is nothing good about being poor, so she believes she just needed to stay firm there for a year and graduate peacefully. Then she decides to talk to her sister, holding her necklace and speaking to her, which makes Lee hear her voice. Doha tries to call Dovi and asks why she is being ignored since she hasn't replied since then. She was even ignoring her messages and not answering calls, which worried Lee as he touched his ear. Those voices started again. The protagonist says that Lee was funny for having a party at Chili's, playing PUBG and cartwriter like elementary school kids, catching Lee by surprise because it seemed they were hearing his whole conversation just now, and he looks around. Meanwhile, his friends were discussing making a reservation at Chili Crabs and that they couldn't, and Mina suggests the recently famous 05. Oh mentions that this restaurant was owned by Hata Oh, which surprises one of them. Lee, still looking around, asks who this Hate was, surprising his friends because they went to the same kindergarten. He was small, quiet, and pathetic back then, but his father's business grew, and he quickly moved from apathetic to calm. Doha continues telling Doe that Lee, adored by Korean girls, was a fool and clearly everyone was deceived by his good looks, until she looks to the side and ends up staring directly at Lee, creating an awkward and super weird situation. Lee puts his hand on Jessica's shoulder and excuses himself, asking them to wait a bit, worrying Doha because he should have recognized her, which should be impossible. But as he continued walking determinedly in her direction, she just turns and decides to run away, determined to ignore him as much as possible. The protagonist runs away from Lee until something passes between her legs. Caught by surprise, she realizes it looked like a cotton ball, but it was actually the black cat that appeared. Doha realizes it was the same cat that entered through the dog hole that connected to the summer's dormitory, and she picks it up in her hands, saying, although it was great to see it again. Now she was a bit busy and therefore couldn't play with it. That's when she bumps into someone else and looks up in their direction. It was a student with dark hair and blue eyes, revealing that the cat was his. However, the cat hisses angrily at the boy. Squirming in Dova's hands, she apologizes because she didn't know it had an owner. The boy observes the girl, ignoring the cat's irritation, and notices she was from Apethek, and she agrees, saying that was right when another person approaches, walking behind Doha. It was Lee who was looking for her, and the protagonist quickly looks back. Worried about being caught, she wonders what she should do because he clearly recognized her. The boy in front of her notices that Doha seemed nervous with Lee nearby, and to the protagonist's surprise, he pulls her close, hiding her face in his chest. When Lee finally looks in their direction, he sees the boy hugging Doha. The boy looks at Lee and introduces himself as Taeo Do, who was in cum, smiling at Lee while hugging a confused Doha. Lee stares at the couple hugging behind the building and looks with a surprised expression, before turning, scratching his neck, and wondering why they were hugging in the middle of the street. The protagonist looks back, surprised because indeed Lee started to move away from them. Peeking at the nervous boy, something catches her attention, and she realizes that the earring in his ear looked strangely familiar. While reflecting on this, Doha had to look back at Tae again because the cat had jumped from her arms into Tae's, now much calmer and more relaxed near its owner, who was smiling. Tae pets his cat's head and says it seemed to accept her too, which was a rarity because that cat wasn't friendly with many people. The boy asks if Doha was okay because she seemed to be in a complicated situation earlier, and she hesitates, remembering how she was pulled into a sudden hug, feeling a bit embarrassed as she hadn't realized he did that to help her, but she thanks him after a moment, realizing her intuition was indeed good. Even fidgeting with her hair to release her nervousness, Tae reaches out to correct her strands, and he welcomes her, happy to have helped, despite finding the situation a bit funny. That's when he extends a card to her, saying this was the restaurant he had, but didn't manage alone. She could check it out because it was near the back, and taking the card, Doha is surprised as they had only met once in life, and he already made this invitation. Tae pets his cat and mentions that it was always around there too, which makes her a bit shy. And he proceeds to say with a smile that its name was Leo and introduces himself again as Tae-o. Later in her room, the protagonist throws herself back on her bed, thinking she almost got confused. Still, the earring that Lee was wearing a bit earlier was bothering her a lot. Suddenly, she sees her phone vibrating with notifications and answers quickly upon seeing it was her sister calling, sitting up in bed with a jump. Doe says she was doomed, sounding desperate on the other end of the line. Doha asks what happened, and her sister, under the covers, begins to tell her that she lost her earring. This catches the protagonist by surprise, and she asks when it happened. Crying, her sister reveals that it happened last Saturday while she was at a cafe she found on Instagram. She remembers being in a crowded cafe, super excited next to another girl who was her friend. And they talked about how this cafe was Lee's friend's because he always went there whenever he went to Seoul on the weekends, showing her phone to her friend. On the phone, there was a picture of Lee with his friends at the cafe, which surprised Dohee's friend because they could meet him. Not only them, but several other girls were there, waiting for the opportunity to meet and see Lee. And Dohee was super excited, loving the idea of meeting him, and the two girls decided to go every weekend to try to see him. On the way, her earring slipped off her ear and fell inside the cafe without her noticing. A few hours later, Lee found the earring in the seat at the cafe and held it close, a bit curious while drinking from his cup because it was a very beautiful and shiny piece. Now Lee was wearing the earring, wondering whose voice he kept hearing since the day before, and probably it was the girl from before. Meanwhile, his friends kept calling his attention because the restaurants were all booked and someone needed to talk to get a reservation. Lee looks at them and agrees he would handle it even though it was a very popular place. So he leaves his room and goes down the stairs under the gaze of several students, wondering what Tae's nickname was in the past and why he was called ugly. Remembering how he and Tae were when they were 7 years old, he considers that maybe he was some strange country boy. Suddenly, entering the busy place, he notices this should be the restaurant in question where they wanted a reservation, and approaches a short boy with black hair who was nearby, calling him by the name Tae, but someone else calls for Lee just before, catching him by surprise. Looking to the side, the real Tae appears, approaching Lee, who asks who exactly he was, and Tae says he heard that Lee wanted to see him and talk about something. Lee's a bit surprised to discover that this was the real Tae. For some reason, he was tall and cool, different from what he imagined, but he was also the one who hugged Doha in the street. The two boys stare at each other to the delight of the girls who loved the sight of handsome men. The girls scream that Lee and Tae were together, which made the protagonist tense while walking nearby, looking to the side to see that strange interaction about to unfold, wondering why they were talking and approaching to see the conversation. Tae crosses his arms and asks if the Summers and Magnus party would be held at their restaurant, and Lee immediately agrees, smiling at the other boy, asking if it was okay to do so, seeming radiant with the decision, with Lee insisting that Tae not worry about money because he would compensate him in various ways so he wouldn't suffer a loss. Doha spies on the conversation, thinking that Lee's earring looked a lot like her sister's and wondering how that happened. But by chance, she decides she should confirm and holds her necklace to try to talk to Lee. While the boy was happily talking with Tae, he hears a voice saying he was a big idiot, and being distracted by what he just heard and talking at the same time, he tells Tae they would rent, calling him an idiot. This obviously irritated the other, but Lee is confused with himself about what he just said, trying to give an excuse for what happened. Doha is shocked and asks if he could hear her voice when she talked like that, and Lee shouts that it was obvious he could hear and asks where she was at once, still shouting in the middle of the crowd of students, asking where she was, which made everyone murmur about how strangely Lee was acting, leaving the protagonist even with secondhand embarrassment. It was crazy to think that idiot was speaking out loud instead of responding mentally. Doha turns to leave, thinking she must be crazy to communicate with Lee like this. But not only that, she realizes that all this time she had been bad-mouthing Lee for him to hear in his mind. And she almost cries mentally for what she had done in the past few days, ruining even more a relationship they didn't even have, which makes her question if she should just give up on any interaction with Lee at this point. The scene cuts to the students' dining hall, where Yura is happy to see her friend again, smiling at Doha before being startled by her ghostly appearance. The protagonist murmurs to herself, wondering what she should do several times, leaving Yura confused. We go back to memories of the past in the big city, where a car accident had just happened with a black car hitting the rear of an orange car. The couple driving, with the woman in the back seat, hold on during the impact, and the driver gets out of the car, furious, asking who caused that big mess. When another voice approaches, asking if he was okay, and it was two well-dressed men, one all in black and the other all in grey. The two seemed to be very important and strangely imposing people. which confuses the driver because he seemed to recognize the man in grey from somewhere until Do-hee tells her father to look closely, because this man in grey was also on the big screen on top of a building in the exact same angle and pose, giving a speech about something in an exclusive seminar about the Gooch School from the British Guards Selection Committee. After being caught off guard by what had just happened, time passes, until the protagonist ran out to find out what happened to her parents. Desperate after the accident, she finds her parents in the hospital, lying on stretchers and complaining of neck and head pains, as well as her sister Do-hee, who complained that her shoulders were exhausted from so much pain. Do-hee is confused by the chaotic scene and asks what was happening. When they realize it was just their other daughter, Do-hee's father acts normally, and Do-hee sighs in relief, telling their mother that everything was fine and it was nothing serious, which surprised the protagonist. The protagonist's father says they found a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity and holds her hand, telling her super happily that they crashed the car on the street with none other than the president of the Gooch School. Do-hee is shocked to hear this and asks if he means that school in Southeast Asia that only chaebols could enter, and her father agrees, excitedly telling her that instead of accepting the settlement money, he asked to enroll Do-hee in the International School of Gooch, catching her completely by surprise. Her mother approaches, saying that although it was wrong, it was a lot to accept the settlement money because Gooch School was incredible and full of amazing people. Do-hee agrees and points to her sister, saying that if she studies there, she would get a free pass to find a job, and everyone in the school must be paid millions of won. Her father starts crying because their family has always been poor and struggling, but now they could breathe a little, being an opportunity sent from the heavens. The protagonist raises her voice, asking her parents to wait and if they would accept her just because they asked, as it seemed impossible. Meanwhile, the president holds an envelope and considers that they should allow Do-hee to enter the school, hearing from the man in black and opening the envelope that they were more problematic opponents than he thought, and if they refused to hear his request, Mr. Kang Man-soo, Do-hee's father, would stage a one-man protest and claimed that his family would go through a re-evaluation. They were determined to stay in the hospital until the end, creating drama about their body pains, so the nurses would be worried and they would feel guilty. The president looks at the papers in the envelope and asks if they were from a family of swindlers to act like that, and the other man hesitates before denying it, saying that according to background research, the Kang family was highly praised. Their previous generations made donations and good deeds, and the evaluation from people around them was also very good. This makes the president sigh, wondering how they could act that way despite this, to which the other man says that just because they did good things didn't mean they lived economically well. From generation to generation, that family didn't have the ability to make much money and seemed to have difficulties. Taking their family photo, the president analyzes and reflects on the words of the man in black, hearing that especially Man-soo seemed to be in a tough situation because when the financial sector failed, he worked as a taxi driver and went above and beyond. It was said that the eldest daughter, Do-hee, had an accident while trying to save someone in danger, which was why they were suffering more financially. Subsequently, the two daughters studied well but couldn't support them, which limited them and was the reason they were so persistent with their education. Now they could understand their situation and lament their current life and dramatic actions to get the president's attention. Still, his head hurt just thinking about it. He says that after considering the request, it would be impossible to admit her by the rules, but he didn't want to create a scandal by ignoring such a family's request. Later, the protagonist's parents burst confetti in celebration because she would be enrolled in the Gooch School. With her family smiling and overjoyed, they hand Do-hee the envelope for her to sign so everything would be finalized. Upon opening the envelope, she sees that it is a confidential contract she needs to sign, and asks if she could really enroll just with this, and her parents agree, saying she was the family's hope, asking her to just focus on graduating until then. Then her sister Do-hee calls for attention, asking her to be careful with Lee, the teen idol, and it would be good if she regularly reported on how he was doing. This shocks the protagonist because they were all using her directly by resorting to something like this, but she couldn't refuse. And now all she could do was cry with her head laid on the table. Eventually, Do-hee went to school after agreeing to the contract's terms, but it seemed she would be sent home soon for having talked to Lee all the time, especially for badmouthing him directly to his face. The protagonist shrinks in her seat when Oh looks for his friend Rowoon, and Lee says that Tai would rent the restaurant for them to prepare the party. but apparently, Ta himself wanted to be present as one of the conditions for using the space, which didn't bother Oh at all because he was a nice guy. Mina agrees because he was the restaurant's owner, and Jessica mentions that partying at 05 restaurant was indeed exciting. They celebrate because it was all thanks to Lee's actions, and now they could prepare the party without worrying about anything else. Lee affirms that he would help them too because if O enrolled in the Hero League with donations and not skills, the shareholders will ignore him, even with succession rights. As expected, the top student of the school thought differently. The boy says he asked a famous party planner he met in an international community program sponsored by the Haesung Group last time, and looks at his phone just as he received a message from that same planner, saying that he personally helped him once and now he agreed to help in return, making his friends happy with his contacts and achievements. Jessica mentions that the Haesung family was famous for their exemplary life, and Nina gets excited because rich people had strong friendships, already imagining her beloved father-in-law. Until Lee mentions that he and his father think differently from the chaebols now, having donated a lot, focusing on paying attention to the international environment and setting an example for society. At this, the blue-haired boy admires his friend Lee because he was practically perfect in every aspect, which makes Mina agree with a love-struck smile that he was indeed, and would be even more if he dated her. Taking advantage, she asks what Lee would do after classes, suggesting he could help her learn math, leaning on his desk. Jessica is surprised because Mina appeared at Lee's desk in a short time. But the boy agrees with Mina that it was a great idea and holds her shoulder. After all, focusing on her studies was important as he had been attending online lectures and would send her the password to access them again, shattering the poor girl's expectations. Mina accepts his offer anyway, mentally crying because he was so slow with her flirting. Yura sighs because Rowoon and the Summers were going to have a party at the 05 restaurant, which made her envious. That's when the protagonist realizes something and takes the card she received as a gift from Tar. Later, she visits that restaurant, following the instructions on the card, and finds the cat Leo lying on one of the tables, very relaxed. The protagonist quickly approaches the cat, happy that he recognizes her, and the animal stretches on the table. Then something catches Do's attention, a notebook next to Leo with several photos of Lee. Before she could look closer, Tae's voice startles her, and she turns around when he calls her name. He approaches her, commenting that she actually came to visit the restaurant and closes his notebook, asking if Doha came to see Leo at his restaurant, and she agrees that was part of it, but also because she had something to ask. Still, her mind questions what was happening. After all, the content of that diary had notes about Lee that caught her completely by surprise. Finally, the grand party for O happens, and several elegant students are invited to the restaurant. All of Lee's friends are very well dressed with their flashy brand clothes and accessories, and they have fun at the party, celebrating and talking with big smiles. Among them, our protagonist was dressed more humbly, impressed by all the sparkle of that environment. She could barely stop looking at how incredible and high-tech the party was, from the PUBG games to the other attractions. Doha thought she knew how far the Gucci students were, but the difference was huge. It didn't even seem like a high school-level party. Walking through the party, she finally finds the person she was looking for. Sitting with his group of friends in a slightly elevated area was Lee Rowoon, smiling and as well-dressed as all his other companions. Mina gives him a big smile, thinking that despite everything, she didn't like shooting games. The other girls admire Lee from a distance, commenting that he really was attractive and cool. But the real reason Doha came to that party full of elegant people was something else. Someone approaches her and calls her name, making her turn to look in the direction of Tao, who asks what she was doing, placing his hand on his hip. Doha is surprised to see him and even feels her face heat up a little at how elegant he also looked. To her surprise, he holds her wrist and gently pulls her, saying that she was the one who asked for the one-day job, so she shouldn't waste time there but help him, which makes her agree, even if hesitantly. Doha sighs, thinking it was something she would do for the sake of her sister Dohee's airing. Then she is sent to the party kitchen, where she picks up some plates of the prepared meals for the guests. And she recalls when she talked to Ta in the past when she first visited his restaurant, nervously commenting that she heard about a party happening at that restaurant. Ta listens calmly when she asks if they need a helper because she would like to work part-time for a day. The boy pets his cat, asking why she wanted that job since it didn't seem like she needed money. And Doha makes up an excuse that she was just bored and that one day she would become a summer or magna, so she was just curious about the party. Thus, the protagonist asked Ta for the part-time job to infiltrate the party. In the present, she ends up in that kitchen but wonders how she could get the opportunity to retrieve the earring. And if she unfortunately gets caught by Lee, her entire school life would be thrown away for sure. The girls would mock her while the boy would remain on his school king's throne. Mentioning that Doha was audacious, even though she was just an apothecary, and even commenting that she was super poor to the point of not being able to live up to those standards. Surely the whole school would start labeling her that way, and she despairs at the thought of being expelled and held accountable for the damages caused. Breaking her thoughts, Tai asks if she finished preparing the food, and Doha agrees a bit distracted before he tells her to go out and serve it at the main table. Since it was an urgent request, he instructs her to be quick, and nervously she agrees with the orders received. Doha grabs the board with the first dish and prepares to leave the kitchen, balancing several boards with different dishes in her arms, surprising Ta. It doesn't take long for the protagonist to organize all the dishes correctly on the main table, which impresses Ta, watching from a distance, realizing she knew how to work properly. Meanwhile, at Lee's table, the friends continue chatting when the protagonist approaches to clear the empty dishes. She looks up, thinking it would be easier if she could just get the earring back without Lee discovering it. Then Lee suddenly starts talking to Oh, straightening up in his seat, asking if he knew about this, looking at his friend. Doha thinks this was her only chance to have a peaceful life at that school, and maybe the party was her golden opportunity. Meanwhile, Lee says that if S puts Suji in a bad situation, it could be the moment to save her, which excites the boy with the idea they were having. So if he did that, Suji could see him in a different situation, and that boy turns his attention to a light-haired girl among the other students. Minna points out that Suji was very popular, and another student says that if played correctly, it could increase his popularity, which makes Jessica agree. Oh agrees excitedly because it was indeed a great opportunity for him to save himself at that party, and Doha hears everything in silence, thinking that this method to gain popularity was a simplified plan that even children knew. However, it seemed fun, but she couldn't believe they cared so much about classroom tasks and prepared to take the used dishes away from the table. It was then that Lee suddenly raised his gaze, staring directly at Doha in the middle of the hall, and he made a confused expression upon realizing who was attending to the table, making the protagonist tense as she seemed to have been caught. Lee asks if she had stared at him and suddenly stands up from the table, leaving his friends confused. The protagonist turns her face away, but he approaches, noticing that her face seemed familiar, and asks if they had met before. She tries to step back despite Lee, insisting she must be a student at the school, and asks her to remove her hat so he can recognize her. Doha gets tense, realizing she would be discovered so quickly, closing her eyes as she realizes she is in trouble. Suddenly, Tai approaches the commotion and asks what is going on there, mentioning that they were very busy and telling Doha to go back to the kitchen to clean and finish her work. At this, she takes the opportunity to run away, even with Lee reaching out and telling her to wait. When she disappears from view, Lee looks at Tai and wonders what his problem was. After Tai notices the attention, he asks if the maid did something wrong or if Lee had something to tell him. And deciding to leave it aside, Lee just denies the questions. Meanwhile, the girls are almost emotional, looking at the conversation between the two handsome boys, seeming like a heavenly sight. They get excited to the point of starting to follow them on social media, finding Tai especially attractive. Meanwhile, Lee sits back in his seat, commenting that it bothers him, catching the attention of one of his friends, who agrees because Tai was indeed a problematic topic. Meanwhile, the girls, including Suji, mention that Tai was cool even if he wasn't her type. They move away to get some drinks at another table at the party. And from a distance, the protagonist observes the situation, still sweating nervously, frustrated because the idiot boys were losing the opportunity to complete their plan to get Suji. At this, Suji approaches another girl named Jae-sune, and the two excitedly start talking. Not only that, but a thread from Suji's clothing was showing, which made Doha run to help her after not being able to just watch any longer. It was then that Tai suddenly approached from behind the protagonist, apologizing, saying he needed to borrow that, and removed the apron that Doha was wearing on her waist, surprising her a bit. Then Tae approached Suji, asking for a moment to fix her clothing, which made both Suji and her friends totally fall for the boy. Meanwhile, Lee and his friends are shocked that their plan was wasted, and the scene unfolds in the middle of the party. Doha observes the situation and smiles to herself, realizing that the idiots acted like children and didn't take the initiative at the right time, and it seems things started to reverse. Meanwhile, Tai tied his jacket around Suji, asking if she could keep it on her body for a bit to disguise her clothing. And somewhat smitten by him, she agrees and thanks him, not having noticed before that her clothing thread had been pulled. The protagonist watches from a distance and realizes that Tai was especially friendly with women, or there must be a reason for being particularly good to Suji, until she remembers that there were more important things to do before that. Somehow things could go the way she wanted, and an opportunity could arise in the midst of chaos. Besides, she wonders how she could get Doi's earring back when it was hard to be discreet, considering she could just grab it and run away. Meanwhile, Suji returns to her friends who were emotional seeing Ta's jacket and interested in knowing about their conversation, only making the situation with Lee and his friends' plan even worse than before. Suji mentions that they don't know each other much, but in just a small way, smiling to herself, until suddenly someone approaches to talk to Suji, and it was a big guy with a slightly weird smile. The boy introduces himself as Soryam and says he is a Magna, asking her if they could be friends just out of nowhere. The girls comment among themselves with an expression of disgust, wondering who that weirdo was who appeared suddenly and that they had never seen him before. It was then that O recognized that this was the S who finally showed up to make their plan work. Lee stands up excitedly, ready to accompany his friend so they can proceed with the steps. Suji responds to Sue that they have been friends since school, a bit tense, and he explains that he would like to be her special friend. This makes her change the subject, saying she is not interested in that kind of relationship yet, feeling uncomfortable. But Sue looks at her in a creepy way, asking if she was rejecting him and if a Magna was on such a different level that they couldn't even be friends, which completely surprises Suji with his sudden conclusion. It was then that Lee alerted O that it was time for him to act so Suji could see him in a different light, and the two hurried down the stairs. Meanwhile, Sue says that she had been ignoring his messages and asks if she thought she was that pretty, pressuring the girl even more, until O arrives running to stop the situation, asking who he thought he was to do that to Suji. But everyone is caught by surprise when everything goes dark and the party lights go out completely. The students get worried because everything went black, nervous about how the party was unfolding. Suddenly, a strong light appears directly on Sue's face, making him cover his face. And the one who used the light from his cell phone was Ta himself, apologizing for the blackout and touching O's shoulder as he passed by. He asked them to wait a bit because they had asked an employee to check the situation. Sue continues to cover his face, not understanding what Tai was doing by focusing the flashlight on him. But Suji soon understands that Tai was protecting her from Sue, placing an arm in front of her to keep her away from the other man. She blushes a little and holds onto his shirt sleeve, hiding behind Ta, which makes Doha curious to know if it was really just an act of kindness. After realizing she was getting distracted again, the protagonist recognizes it is not the right time to be so noisy because the blackout was her golden opportunity. Meanwhile, Lee asks what was happening and where his cell phone was to light up his surroundings. He couldn't see anything because it was dark, not noticing a shadowy Doha ready to put her hands on him. The boy thinks he might have left his cell phone in his bag, not noticing the hands coming from behind him. The protagonist approaches, ready to touch his earring, almost reaching it, when suddenly the lights come back on and the whole hall lights up again. The students look up at the lights, relieved that everything is visible again, including the scene of Doha very close to Lee, with the two staring directly at each other, which makes the protagonist extremely nervous because of all possible moments, the light had to come back right now. Tae apologizes to everyone, saying that the party vibe was great, and they tried to change the lights to make everything more modern, probably causing the blackout. After hearing the apologies, the students say it's okay because the party vibe was great. Meanwhile, Lee stares at the protagonist and asks what she was doing, and Doha nervously steps back, trying to explain and putting her hands behind her back. This time, he would catch her at the right moment and not let her escape again, making Doha sweat nervously, until she turns and runs away, screaming, catching Lee completely by surprise. He shouts, asking if she didn't intend to stop, and she shouts back to stop following her. Do-ha sprints out of the hall, realizing she was in big trouble. A hand grabs her shoulder from behind just in time while she runs, and she ends up screaming again in surprise before falling hard on the ground, hurting her back on impact. To her surprise, Lee pinned her to the ground and asks if she was the one who kept calling him an idiot all the time. Meanwhile, Tai asks the students to continue enjoying the party and to let him know if they need anything. The girls get excited, asking if he wouldn't join the party and get involved with everyone. And he asks if he really could, if they didn't mind smiling at them. Even Suji was completely smitten with Tae, completely ignoring Oh's words. On the beach, Lee continues insisting on knowing if Do-ha was the origin of the voice, and she averts her gaze, answering that it wasn't her. Still, he insists on knowing why she was always running away from him. This makes her reply that it was because he was chasing her like a madman. Lee asks if she really thought he was an idiot, and Do-ha can only think a big yes, turning her face to the side without admitting it. But the boy remembers that she was the pool stalker, but is still confused about her trying to touch his ear and asks if she was really a pervert. Until Do-ha points to his earring and says that it was originally hers and that it was actually a new Bluetooth walkie-talkie. This leaves Lee a bit silent, which worries the protagonist because maybe he wasn't so dumb as to fall for that. But he accepts the answer immediately and asks if that was the reason he could hear Do-ha's voice, which catches her off guard before she nervously agrees with the question, unable to believe he fell for it so easily. In any case, she pushes him away and tells him to get off her now that he knows her reasons. The two stand up from the beach, and Do-ha brushes off her clothes to clean off the sand. Then he asks why she kept calling him an idiot so many times during those days, and she begins to answer the reason for that. When Tai at the party communicates, asking for more mini burgers and macarons to be prepared, to the eyes of the smitten Suji, she asks if there were more of those to eat. And the two spend a pleasant time together, with To drinking in her company with a smile. Meanwhile, Do-ha says that Lee had no idea what was happening around him, and the very Suji they were trying to impress before had just been taken from them. This makes Lee approach the protagonist again, raising his voice to ask how she could know all this, and she asks how she could not know. After all, that was why she kept calling him an idiot so many times, because Lee never knew how to read between the lines, finally throwing the truth in his face. To ensure you don't miss the unfolding of this romance, give a gentle tap on the notification bell, and I see you on the next tale.